Team, welcome back to another week with just Drew and Alex. Here, Alex, a longtime contributor to Mops and Mo's. Thanks for joining. This week, we've got it. We've compiled what we're calling quick hits, a handful of different things about current events, some of the stuff that we've talked about in other episodes, athletic trainers, PT tests, some stuff to do with the Surgeon General.
Mm-hmm.
And then just some conversation around all kinds of different things going on. It's basically, like I said, a current events episode. I don't know if you have any thoughts before we kick things off. There's a lot of current events.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah. It's not necessarily all stuff we can do a deep dive on. So I think that's why this episode felt called for. Just some hot takes without necessarily the deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's start with, well, how about this? Let's hit athletic trainers, because by the time folks are hearing this, hopefully you will have heard our previous episode where we ranted and raved about how stupid it was that the Army was looking to cut athletic trainers. Do you have any further thoughts or stones that we left unturned with regards to ATs?
Well, I think what'll be interesting, no real stones unturned in terms of information necessarily, but this is, if it comes out as an episode, going to come out a few weeks after that episode where we talked about ATs. And we're starting to hear rumblings that things may have changed by the time you're listening to this. So we're having this conversation on May 8th. We'll benchmark it in real world time. You're probably listening to it like 2 or 3 weeks after that. And nothing to announce right now, but multiple sources have mentioned that the kind of informal campaign to get attention brought, I guess it was pretty formal on NATA's side, informal on our side, but there has been like pretty serious effort to keep this issue in the conversation, and it seems like that may actually lead to something. We'll see.
What Alex is saying there, team, is that we've heard things. We've heard things leading us to believe that this might change, might look different. Like you said, May 8th today, by the time you guys hear this, could be changed. What's interesting to me, at least, is that I think either you or I mentioned this a while back. At the time, it felt like a conspiracy theory, but basically, hey, I wonder if General Mingus is announcing this 5 months early to generate heat to try and force DHA's hand.
Chestnut checkers, baby.
Yeah, and it seems as though that may actually pan out, which is pretty sick.
If that's the case, that's pretty cool.
Pretty cool. Like, tip of the cap, sir.
We'll sneak something in here. This is just to get a quick hit so I can post it. Maybe we'll see. Get a shout out there to the people that don't spend the time to listen to our full podcasts. But, and this is a hard one because I've said this before, the hardest thing to research is how much things matter compared to each other. But arguably, the part of an H2F team that has the best evidence for it saving more money than it costs might be those athletic trainers.
So what I hope is that by the time this episode comes out, we are forced to walk back all of the things we said in the original athletic trainer episode, because it does in fact turn out that the Army cares about its people, and this could be a huge win for embedded humor performance and, truthfully, for the athletic training industry. So
if you're out there listening and you're on General Mingus's team,
get them on.
Give us a call.
Yeah, we'd love to chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, like we said, quick hits here. Let's go Casey Means. Let's talk about Casey.
I think you might have been the person who first got me to pay attention to Casey Means.
So Casey Means, for folks that might not know, Casey Means is the sister of, what's his name?
Callie Means.
Callie Means. And these two siblings are quite high profile in the Make America Healthy Again movement. They co-wrote that book, Good Energy, that we talked about. I have not read it. I don't think you've read it. But the premise behind it seems sound, I guess, as most books try to do. But a bit of background here. So Casey Means, she is a doctor, right?
Has an MD, that's correct.
Has an MD, went to Stanford, graduated from Stanford in 2014, but dropped out of her surgical residency 4 years later and sort of switched. And this is the wave that she's been riding. She switched into functional medicine, sort of alternative medicine, alternative treatments, that kind of stuff.
And there are valid arguments, right? That like we're doing unnecessary surgeries. This isn't actually going to help people. We need to target lifestyle stuff,
Sure.
all that.
Sure. So, you know, we're walking a fine line here because there's some goodness in that. There's also some like questions raised in that decision, but doesn't matter. Here we are today. It's been announced that Casey Means is now the nominee, I guess is the way to phrase that, for the Surgeon General position of the United States of America, which is interesting because if you think about what happened, basically the original Surgeon General, or I guess the original nominee, Dr. Jeanette Neishawat,
Don't know.
Nesheiwat, Neshewat.
Sure.
Anyway, her nomination was withdrawn over concerns about her medical credentials, A, and B, her alignment with the administration's health agenda. What's interesting is that Casey Means does not, as of 2024, have medical credentials. But I guess her agenda aligns with the administration. So anyway, there's been some rumblings within the Make America Healthy Again movement. Apparently, this is a controversial um, appointment or nomination for some of those folks in the MAHA movement who they say RFK Jr. told them that this would never happen. Here we are, it's happening. So anyway, just an interesting, thing. I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts. I
I
know you
think
don't love Casey Means.
no, I'm obviously not the biggest fan. If you've listened to our Maha episodes,
Mm-hmm.
you already know how I feel. And what I said at the time was I don't agree with everything in the Maha platform, but that I was optimistic and hopeful that this would push us in the direction of some genuinely bipartisan action that everybody can agree on, right? Like helping feed people better, helping get people more active, all those kinds of things. And hopefully you listened to the Michael Moss episode, but I'm starting to get less optimistic because they do seem to inevitably, kind of the way politics goes, be focused more on distractions and side issues. And it's really more of the same. It's hard to keep the hype going when they're not doing the things that I think most people agreed could have been positive.
She's also the co-founder with her brother of
Mm-hmm.
Levels, which we've talked about before, health technology company. They
Continuous glucose monitors.
Yep, CGMs, supplements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Number of things. So, you know, I think it goes without saying potential conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess my final take on that would be that I'm curious, I'm wary, but I'm curious. Functional medicine, like I said, there's some goodness there, but man, you're flirting with sunning buttholes at this point when you're putting these kinds of people in these positions. So we'll see what happens.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yep. Do you want to talk about, I know, standing power throw? Team, this episode of Mops and Moes is brought to you by Train Heroic. Train Heroic is a reliable, well-designed platform for programming, tracking, and communicating with athletes. If you've been with us for any length of time, you will know that Train Heroic is the platform that we use to power our own training, long and strong, which you can find at our website, mopsandmoes.com. If you're looking for a solid platform to support your own coaching, whether it's your full-time role or a side hustle, Train Heroic is definitely worth checking out. You can use the link in any of our show notes. You can find it in our newsletter, or you can head to our website, mopsandmoes.com/training to get your first week for free. Slight little transition there. Speaking of,
No, we said it's hot takes, it's quick hits. We're moving on. You guys have heard extensive thoughts on this. We'll do the quick hits version of the thoughts. I don't think until the last few weeks I even really had a strong opinion either way on the standing power throw. I think if you'd like randomly asked me like what event I would have chosen for power, I would have said standing broad jump, but that doesn't mean I hated the standing power throw. But as you dig into the research around it, it starts to raise questions about how valid and reliable assessment it is, whether the construct validity is really there for assessing power, how much it's influenced by body mass, how much we're practicing technique rather than training for power. So I think, I mean, if we had to lose an event, I probably would have argued for losing the plank before losing the standing power throw, but I'm not that upset by losing it. I don't know.
yeah, I don't get bogged down in the testing data so much as like the messaging, and we may bring this back up a little bit later in the episode, but like, again, I mentioned this in the long form conversation we had, but with as much time, energy, effort, lobbying, etc., went into the creation of the ACFT, the messaging there was that here is a test that we care about, that we've put a lot of time into, that we've put a lot of effort into. We can justify every piece of it. Here you go, boom, go forth, take the test. To just like remove one of the things and then not really have any answers. I know, we've talked to some folks, we've seen articles written, but at the end of the day, like, does it make sense, or is it just more of like a, hey, that looks dumb, let's take it out? I don't know. I think it raises a lot of questions about what is the point of testing and what what can we expect in the future as far as tests becoming political weapons versus actual metrics that we can train by.
Here's a hot take.
Please.
I hope the test keeps changing, and I hope it changes more.
That's fair. What frequency would you want to see that change, though? Like every month?
That the hard part of that is that it is how fast can policy really change, because every time you change it, there's like an adaptation period and like a partial consequences period and then a real consequences period, and lawyers get involved and all that stuff. So like in an ideal world, I wish the test changed every time you took it. I wish there was like a bingo roller thing, and like a ball
You
came out with a
mean
strength event and a ball came out with an aerobic event, yada yada
CrossFit?
yada, and you just did it, right? Because I think that would require you to be actually fit rather than practicing for a test. And we've talked about Goodhart's law on here, right? Like if you, doesn't matter how good an assessment is, if somebody just practices only the assessment, it breaks
Hmm.
its relationship with the outcomes you cared about in the first place. So I don't know if I have an answer for the frequency, because I think that would require a very different regulatory regime where you could still hold service members accountable even if it was changing a lot. So I'm talking perfect world kind of stuff that doesn't exist.
This is not necessarily what I think they should do, but what would the Army look like if there was not a PT test?
Hmm.
Like, do you think the military could function without a PT test?
I mean, I'm going to say something cynical. Most MOSs in the Army, there's no test for being good at your job.
Unpack that.
I worked in Intel. That was my thing while I was in the Army.
I see what you're saying. Nobody ever checked your intel ability.
Yeah, like you could be an idiot and have no idea what you're doing and not know any of the doctrine or how to operate any of the systems, and there weren't really consequences for that. Like it might slow down promotions, and you might not be
I
like
was gonna say,
in medals all the time, but
I think they think, I guess they being sort of the universal they, I think they think that the OER and NCOER system solves for that. I think we all know that that's not true.
yeah. And I think that you asked what would happen if there was no PT test. I think you'd have to trust that like the culture and the evaluations enforce it. And in some places, I think they would, and in other places, I do not think they would.
Yeah, I guess you'd have to have some other mechanism by which you can eliminate people.
That's the real thing.
Right. But which is interesting though, because even if people fail PT tests, eliminating them because of that seems very difficult
I've talked about this with a few different people.
from what I've
I
seen.
think I think the superpower of the special operations side of the army is that they have an easier time removing people. You can just like send them off to Gen Pop.
Hmm.
Then the rest of the force has a pretty hard time kicking people out, and there's packets and processes and timelines and requirements and hoops to jump through.
Do you think what would be the ramifications that I'm not thinking through if we made it easier to eliminate people from the army? We're
I think
kind
the
of
part
riffing
people
now
avoid
because
talking about. Yeah, we're going too deep down a rabbit hole, but regardless, I think a big part of the problem is at a certain point, you need bodies.
sure,
And if you make it too easy to remove people, you don't have as many people. So that said, I've said many times that I would love to be a part of a leaner
yeah,
but more effective force.
1000%, yes.
And I think we spend a huge amount of our time in the force dealing with the problems. So maybe if you could get rid of people, like I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there is this like castle in the sky of an army where like you just get kicked out and people stop worrying about you. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think, and this is the last point I'll make on this because you're right, we're diving down a rabbit hole. But like my perception, having worked now for multiple branches for multiple years, is that the structure of the military is still very much based on large scale, peer to peer,
Mm-hmm.
open battlefields, lots of people, which is fine. But my opinion maybe would be that now more than ever, if you look at the history of sort of modern warfare, you do have a case to be made for a leaner, meaner force because things like drones, et cetera, are massive force multipliers. So you could argue, But I think what's interesting is that the positions that allow you to multiply like that tend to be the least physically demanding.
Mm.
So then we're back to
That's the
like,
struggle.
exactly. So look at us. We've uncovered a conundrum and we've dove down a rabbit hole, and we'll stop there. Maybe that's a future episode.
I agree.
Okay, so standing power throw removed. The new combat standard. Walk us through this because you are more well versed in this than I am.
I think there are a few interesting things. Hopefully, people already understand what it is because we did a whole episode on that. But if not, if you are in one of the identified close combat military occupational specialties, you still have a minimum of 60 points per event, but you have to get 350 points overall. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, you're following the combat scale, which is the men's scale. So you have to get at least 60 in each event, but anytime you're getting 60, that means you have to make up points towards a 70-point event average somewhere else. This is kind of rewinding to the standing power throw thing. The one thing I think that is unequivocally good about removing the standing power throw is that we return a little bit of relative weighting to aerobic capacity,
Hmm.
right? When the run is one of 6 events, you can get a great score getting 60 points in the run and doing well on everything else because you're big and you don't do cardio. I think as you chip away at those other events, you return some relative importance back to the run. I know there's lots of run haters out there, but like aerobic efficiency, aerobic capacity, absolutely foundational to fitness, whether combat or general. So I think that's a good thing. I think it's odd that certain MOSs like 13 Bravo and 68 Whiskey weren't on there. Combat is literally in the name, combat medic. And like having read through a little bit of the process by how they're going to do this, if you are in a close combat MOS and you can't meet the combat fitness standards, they have a list of priority MOSs that you're going to get transferred into. One of those is combat medic. So pretty soon, the combat medic profession is going to be full of people who couldn't be infantrymen because they couldn't meet the combat standard. And now they're going to ask to keep up with infantrymen carrying aid bags and trying to like perform a technical skill under a high level of physical stress. I don't know how I feel about that. And then last one, having been an intel guy in infantry units, I really think there needs to be a conversation about, does the MOS matter more or does the unit you're assigned to matter more, right? Like a 68 Whiskey in a hospital, I get it. 68 Whiskey in an infantry unit, probably just as, if not more physically demanding than some of those close combat MOSs.
I'm making this up as I go, and you know this world better than I do, so please. It seems like a lot of the conversation around PT testing has to do with test structure, and I'm wondering if instead we should look at test timing. You talked
Explain.
about, well, like the billet unit of assignment thing. I'm just wondering if, like, as a maneuver element approaches the kind of on ramp towards a deployment, and I know that this is like an ideal world scenario, but my assumption would be that you sort of know who you're going to war with a certain, number of
Decently. Yeah.
month, right? So maybe there's an elevated like pre-combat standard that everybody associated with that element has to pass in order to be eligible for the upcoming deployment. So like if you're getting attached to a combat unit, like in your case, an intel guy, you would know in advance, like you basically have to go through a quote unquote selection for that deployment by passing this higher standard. And then at that point, it's MOS agnostic. It just has to do with who is going out the door. And then when you're in garrison, there's sort of a garrison standard. And maybe that's the world where you have a little bit more freedom to choose different movements, or you can do the hopper thing like you've recommended. But that to me is a more appropriate way of like looking at testing than just trying to fight over should we do a deadlift or a fucking leg tuck. I don't know.
I
I just
agree.
made that up. So I don't know if that works
So
or not.
Drew says he just made it up, but Drew like damn near accidentally regurgitated exactly what DoD instruction 1308.3 says,
There you go.
which it describes 2 different kinds of test. And this has been a problem for the ACFT from the beginning because the DoD instruction says you have a general fitness test. This is supposed to like predict risk of injury, overall health, making sure we're not having people in the force that pose like a health burden to the organization. And the way it's described in the instruction indicates that it would be normed for age and sex and things like that. Then you have high physical demand occupational tests that are for specific jobs within the military. And these are supposed to be based on the actual physical demands of the test. They're supposed to be age and sex neutral. The Army messed around and tried to combine the two. And I think the Army might have a reasonable argument that being a soldier is a high physical demand occupation, right? The ACFT was not based on specific MOS tasks. It was based on general soldier high physical demand tasks, what we call warrior tasks and battle drills that every soldier is expected to be able to perform. But it got tripped up because that's not the way the DoD sees it. So now we end up in this situation where technically the ACFT is it's called the AFT for a reason now. They took the word combat out because it's not supposed to be a test of those specific occupational demands. It's just supposed to be a test of general fitness. That was to get it back in line with DoD policy, or at least it seems like it was to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to see the longevity of this kind of thing. And I'm still not, I know we mentioned this in the post recording after we had Command Sergeant Major Harris on. I don't know if I'm comfortable with the answer as to why it is gender normed but not age normed.
Other way around.
Sorry, age norm. No.
Yeah.
What did I say?
You said gender normed but not age normed. It's age normed but not gender normed.
Right.
Or we'll say it more clearly, is sex neutral,
There you go. There
but
you
with
go.
scores adjusted for age.
For age. Right. Which, again, like I understand. I was about to say elderly. I understand like a more aged population having a slightly lower standard, but explain that to me in a better way than just saying, "Oh, the enemy doesn't care if you're a man or woman." It's like you're right. They also don't care if you're 60 or 25. So, like, give me a better reason.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's just we've already touched on that, but I just I just wish there was a world where when we're going to change something so visible as the PT test, we had better explanations than just look at the data. It's like stop
Especially
it.
when we can't see the data.
Yeah.
Just saying.
So, okay, new combat standard. Do you want to talk about how we changed the test? Do you want to talk about
How
our
I ask you this question.
please?
If you had the keys to the kingdom,
What's
you
my
are
ideal PT
fitness
test?
king of the army.
Mm-hmm.
What's the PT test?
I know we have done this in several different iterations, and as I sit here today, I think where I'm at, where I've arrived at, I don't know if I'll ever change this, is a deadlift, a number of pull-ups. I don't know what that number is, and a somewhere between 3 and 5 miles of running, and that's it.
The only one I would consider adding in, because I agree with those, and I'm honestly okay. Well, the physiology nerds would tell you that the 1.5 mile run correlates best
But I don't
with
give a shit.
VO2 max, and I agree with you because I think now we're reverse engineering a metric, right? And the metric is just an indicator; it's not the thing. And part of running longer distances is like VO2 max is part of it, but also volume tolerance, tissue tolerance, all things that are totally relevant to military performance. So I am also okay with a slightly longer run. I would like to see in there, and like it becomes a debate of how minimalist versus maximalist you want the test to be. There's all sorts of cool things that we fun to add in there, like an Atlas stone lift or something to test something more functional, whatever. But if we're trying to be as minimalist as possible, test only the things we really need to test to run the program we want to run. I like deadlifts. I like pull-ups. I like a long distance run. I kind of like throwing in there a 300-yard shuttle, couple minute rest, 300-yard shuttle again. Score is the average of the two.
Yeah. I guess I'm in my head I'm calling it like first principles testing. Like if we work all the way down to like what movements tell you the most about the most other movements,
Yes.
basically.
Because the 300-yard shuttle repeated would correlate really strongly with the run. No
Right.
shocker there. Yes, there is a difference between like high intensity, short duration, what we'd call anaerobic, versus low intensity, longer duration, what we'd call aerobic.
But
But they do correlate really strongly.
I'm also kind of in the years since I've been doing this, I think I've moved away from testing as like a scientific tool and more towards testing as like a tool for cultural change.
Yes.
I think that to me is way more important than what movement correlates with what research metric. And so the reason
Sure.
I
What
like the
encourages the kind of training you want people to do.
well, not
Yes.
even just the training, but just like the lifestyles. Lifting something heavy, i.e., the deadlift, is going to push you to be strong. It's going to push you to get into the gym. It's going to push you to be like movement proficient. Doing a pull up is going to promote having a lower body weight It's going to promote good, like kinesthetic awareness. It's a skill. It takes time. It also factors in grip strength, which we have talked about being important. And then having a run that's longer forces you to train for it, which forces you to become comfortable with running mechanics, which forces you, and then doing all of those things together kind of justifies having some embedded human performance folks on board, because now you're looking at training more like this, whatever hybrid approach. So I think that's an easier, I should say it's a simpler test. It's not easier. It's a simpler test. Deadlift, pull-ups, run.
All the haters are going to ask why a longer run and not a ruck.
Because look at, like, I don't know, I'm a fan of the longer run because just look at the Marine Corps. I think a reason why their fitness culture is what it is because you have to excel at a longer run. I know 3 miles for some folks isn't long, but it's longer than 1.5. It's longer than 2. Why not a ruck? Because truthfully, I think if you're a good runner and you're a good deadlifter, you're going to do well at rucking. If you're a good rucker, you could just be a fat fuck who can't run. So, sorry, I got heated. I think rucking to me is like, that's the sports specificity piece that you factor into your training calendar. You don't necessarily test for it. And I wouldn't let people profile out of any of those 3 metrics either.
Ooh, it's not even on our list of hot topics to talk about, but let's chat about it.
But what? Profiles?
The alternate events on the ACFT for folks or on the AFT who cannot run are go, no go. You can only score 60 points. There are lots of people with big feelings about that. They think that we should still have incentives for people on profile to be able to score well, meaning a score chart that goes higher. What do you think? Do you think we should have score charts for alternate events or not?
That's a tough one. I don't know. I think yes, but that just sort of allows for you to continue on with the pre-existing issue, which is people writing profiles to avoid like excelling. And so if you want to promote a culture of excellence, I wouldn't necessarily incentivize the profiled soldiers. That being said, I mean, there are plenty of folks that are on permanent profiles who are motivated, are hard. So I don't know. It's the issue for me is the profiling system. It's not so much the test.
I agree completely, by the way. I don't think there should be something called a permanent profile.
Yeah.
I don't like the term.
It's a weird concept.
Yeah. But just to speak directly to the audience for a second, the stated reason for not having score charts for the alternate events is to create an incentive to get people to return to running.
Mm-hmm.
I can see both sides. Because on one side, there's an argument of I have this medical issue, I can't run, it aggravates the thing. Shouldn't there still be incentives for me to stay aerobically fit rather than just meeting this minimum standard? I can do tons of biking, I can do tons of rowing, I can do tons of swimming, whatever. So there's an argument there that we should create incentives for even people on permanent profiles to stay as fit as possible. The argument from like the not caring about the individual, purely caring about the organization is you're a soldier in the army. Part of that is dismounted maneuver, which in some cases looks a lot like running or has very similar demands to running. If we're in a combat scenario, you're not going to hop on your concept 2 rower and like row into the fight. You're not going to hop on your bike and bike into the fight. I don't know whether we've ever had any like mountain bike insertions in the Army's history. I don't know. But the Army has a valid reason to want you to be able to do load bearing on your feet, covering of ground. Mm-hmm. So there's a valid argument on either side. I will say the standards on the alternate events are all over the place.
Yeah.
Inconsistent levels of difficulty, inconsistent correlations with VO2 max. If you even have the slightest idea of how to operate a rowing machine, the rowing standard is an absolute joke. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. That's a bigger conversation about the nature of profiles. Okay. You want to focusing on the test versus the training. Do you want to hit that one?
This one's all over the place. I'm not even going to really talk about. We spent a ton of time talking about the test. Everybody has opinions on the test. What events should be on it, what the score chart should be, whether it should be neutral, whatever. The test is like 1 to 2 days out of the year. I am much more interested in how we spend the other 363 days. And I don't think we have clear answers for how to do that right and what standards people are held to. There's very little policy on unit physical fitness programs. The doctrine is vague. A lot of people don't follow the doctrine. You can interpret the doctrine whatever way you want. It's really unclear. And I am hearing from people that it's gotten better, but at least when I was on active duty, we seemed to care more about the drill and ceremony of PRT, like whether a junior NCO could run a really clean, memorized prep drill, MMD 1 and 2, recovery drill, whatever, than we cared about whether they could design an even somewhat reasonable training program or lead a good workout, whether it was in cadence or not. I think we need to step up our game on how we train and spend less time constantly agonizing over how we test.
Yeah, I think for me, what sealed the deal in terms of how misguided some of this stuff is that there was a morning where I saw a unit doing PRT as a warm up for yoga,
Mm.
which was hilarious. I mean, they were warmed up, I guess, but yeah, that's a tough one because, like, is it the responsibility of the soldier to know all the things to design their own training session, or is that then a conversation about embedded human performance and how
I think
scalable is that? And
in an ideal world, you have professionals that can help with the design of the training program, but they should know how to execute and they should know how to modify for individual needs.
Mhm.
I think that's definitely important. That said, though, I think it's inevitable that large portions of the military, even if we had the best embedded system in the world, there would be isolated elements that are never going to have an embedded person to help them with their program.
Mhm.
And people should have at least a fundamental ability to recognize, like, this is a good program, this is a bad program, stuff like that. I will also
Yeah.
say, back to the PRT piece, the reason I was given all the time was that our junior NCOs need to know how to do PRT because they're going to be graded on it when they go to NCOES. And I'll actually quote General Donahue on this one, or at least paraphrase. I don't think I can exactly quote it because this was like 4 years ago at this point. I remember him complaining about it. And his observation was, oh, cool. So this morning, I'm just a training aid for this specialist to learn how to do the prep drill before he goes to BLC. Like that says we really don't value the actual outcomes of physical training. This is just like a dog and pony show, and we're going to use it not to get you fitter, but to prepare a specialist whoever for BLC. And that's really annoying.
Yeah, I think PT, it's funny because the level of, I mean, we sort of speak ill of the level of aptitude across the military when it comes to PT, but you would hope that America as a culture would be able to get to that level of ineptitude. So it's like, we're at a point where PT is institutionalized, everyone's doing it, great. That's awesome. I mean, like, that's truly fantastic. My problem though is that in some sense PT has become almost weaponized or politicized at different levels. I mean, at the unit level, you've got the hierarchy of first sergeants versus, and like, who's going to actually decide on the day what we're doing, and it's all kind of made up, and who really knows what's going on. And then at the higher levels, you get into discussions around the PT tests and things like that just get thrown around. So I don't know what the right answer is. You would hope that H2F and programs like it are moving us towards what the right answer is, but man, there's a lot of cultural. I think until the military and the Army specifically really figures out how to incentivize a culture of high performance, we're going to be floundering, which I don't know, maybe that's dramatic, but that's how it seems.
It's tough.
It is tough. Get AFEs off post and get rid of the fast food, and then let's talk daily PT. There's a hot take.
I'll give you a quick hot take. We'll
Please.
stray back into political territory for a second. This administration on the DoD side has had a lot of emphasis on lethality, readiness,
What is
fitness.
lethality?
Nobody knows. We'll talk about that later. But one thing I have noticed, and shout out to Rob Evans over at Hots and Cots for this one, I have not seen a single mention of service member quality of life
Hmm.
from the DoD in the last few months. We've gotten in the weeds on like whether transgender service members can serve. We've gotten in the weeds on sex neutral combat fitness standards. We're getting in the weeds on drone swarms and M10 bookers and all sorts of stuff. Lots of transformation. We're going to like mobile brigades, whatever. I don't even know what half the stuff means. But nobody has seemed to pay any attention to the feeding of soldiers and the standard of the barracks for soldiers. I say soldiers, service members in general, how we feed and house our most junior members of every service in the DoD. It seems like that's kind of getting ignored in favor of things that generate much more money for contractors and such.
I think it's easier to create fake solutions than address real problems.
Ooh, got him.
Yeah, I think addressing soldier quality of life is something that is multifaceted, which politicians hate. It will take time, which politicians hate. It will be expensive, which they hate. And I think it will force us to confront things that we don't necessarily want to confront, and people's feelings will get hurt. Institutions will have to shift gears. But I mean, truthfully, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I think we can continue to put band aids on things. And that's really what a lot of these initiatives are. In some sense, I mean, you could even say H2F is a band aid. It's a good band aid, but it's not really, to your point, like it's not really addressing. It's trying to, but there's not enough resources to truly address the issue, which is like when you drill down at the lowest level, private first class, whoever, does the fact that he now has access to hex bars, kettlebells, an app, and a daily survey, does that really fix what's truly bothering that guy? I mean, are we really, have we, and I think back to the conversation we had about like how impactful it can be to just have somebody over for dinner, like little squishy stuff like that, that everyone sort of nods about, like, oh yeah, of course, like that's fucking cool, whatever. But every single day I see young soldiers just get mistreated by either senior leaders and or the system, intentionally or otherwise. Meanwhile, to your point, we're going to have drone swarms. And cool. Like it's fun to play Call of Duty, but have we solved for the lowest common denominator, the private first? I don't think so. So again, I'll sort of repeat what I said. I think it's easier to create fake solutions than address real problems.
I'll get back on my soapbox on a topic I talk about a lot. In the last week, the USS Harry Truman has dropped two FA-18 Super
Two
Hornets
jets,
into the ocean.
which is hilarious.
Roughly speaking, one of those jets costs $70 million. It varies. Lots of things go into the final number. But do you think anybody's going to get asked to justify the return on investment of replacing those
Nope.
Super Hornets? No, they're
Nope.
going to do it because they've agreed that having that capability is important. Yeah, somebody's going to get yelled at and there's going to be investigation. And if there was like wrongdoing or negligence, somebody might get fired and like accountability and stuff will happen. But nobody's going to have to like get up and like argue why and cite a bunch of research for the need to replace those Hornets. They're going to, they're just going to do it. Like that's the cost of doing business because we've agreed that it's important. But when it comes to taking care of the humans that operate those systems, and let's be clear, we know it works and we know it's important because the pilots who operate FA-18s have access to pretty cool human performance programs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's proof that we know it works, is that the people that we count on in those positions, special operators, pilots, things like that, get those things. But when it comes to like normal service members, we have to explain the return on investment cost to convince somebody to care enough to pay the bill that comes with taking care of people. I know that's the world we live in, but that pisses me off every time this conversation comes up.
Well, and what makes it even more nuanced, especially with the athletic trainer situation, is that even when you show the return on investment, even
Yep.
when you meet and even exceed, because we have shown that the savings that the athletic trainers have provided the Army far outweigh the cost.
Mm-hmm.
What more could you ask for? And yet here we are in a position where those athletic trainers are likely to be cut, fingers crossed, but still.
Fingers crossed that they're not cut. Let's be clear.
Fingers crossed that they're not cut, yes. Hashtag save the ATs. So you're sort of left in this position of like, well, what the fuck do you want us to do? I mean, like, what is this? What is the point of any of this? Which sounds nihilistic, but I'll ask you a question. Why do you think that is? Why do you think? Why do you? Okay, here
I can answer
I'll
the question.
well, I'll tie it up nice and tight for you. In a military that continuously tells us people first, why is it that the people first programs are constantly having to justify themselves?
Because leaders don't actually make decisions based on evidence or data. They make decisions based on how they feel about something. And if they haven't been convinced that it works or that it's important, they're like, no amount of data is going to change their mind. Data is used as a justification when they already know what they want to do.
I'll just pause so you can cut that clip and use it. I think that that's true. I think, and just to put a bow on it from my end, what you just said there and what I think we've said multiple times on this podcast, that's the shit we should be talking about at conferences and symposiums. Not what does tactical agility look like and like should we run with rucks on. I think that that stuff can be saved for when we're eating lunch between meetings, but like the true conversation is exactly what you just said. So, for people out there who are listening and have power, please just think about some of these things. Where do you want to go next?
This one's dumb. I just think it's worth discussing because it's funny. All that changed really between the Army combat fitness test and the Army fitness test is the removal of the standing power throw. So if removing the standing power throw removes the combat, does that mean that the standing power throw is the combat part of the test?
If if you think of combat as the hurling of an object towards an enemy, then you could make the case that that is certainly the most lethal, the most potentially lethal movement we had.
That's a good point. I have seen not really. I haven't really seen graders get taken out by a standing power throw, but I have seen like unsuspecting colonels who were just trying to like be present during testing and motivate the troops. I have seen them get taken out.
See, they haven't been taken out by deadlifts or runs.
So the standing
Or
power throw
plank.
confirmed most lethal
For sure, the
and
most
only
lethal.
combat oriented event from the ACFT.
I guess if you had to go to war with only one PT test movement, you'd want the standing power throw, and it's somewhat of a David and Goliath situation where because the English wouldn't let us train with weapons, we trained with med balls. That's a Braveheart quote. I hope
Yeah.
people pick that one up because otherwise, I don't want to be your friend. So yeah, that's inarguable. The power throw was certainly the most lethal. Rest in peace. Are frequent changes to fitness standards a problem, you think?
I mean, I feel like we already talked about this one with like in a perfect world. No, like I would love it to change all the time so that people didn't train to the test. They actually trained to be physically fit and well rounded so they could perform regardless of what the test is. But we live in a world where chapter packets are important and legal opinions are important and administrative processes take a long time to update. So I think there is a balance somewhere in there where I don't think it was good for the force to have the same APFT for 4 decades where we just got used to push-ups, sit-ups, 2 mile run. I think that was bad. I think it's also been bad for other services with push-ups, sit-ups, mile-and-a-half run, whatever service your thing. I think people stop thinking critically about the kind of fitness they should have for the job and the mission, and they just train for the test. So I think it should change enough to avoid that, but not so much that we're never able to actually enforce the standard because the policy is still catching up.
Do you have any idea of how frequently like international militaries change their fitness tests?
That's a good question, and I do not know.
I don't either. That'd be like an interesting thing to look into. To me, this goes back to something I've said many times, which is I think it'd be cool if we could figure out how to use Z scores to have floating standards.
Andrew Thompson, if you're out there listening,
Andrew,
your invite is still open. Please come on the podcast.
still open. Basically, I'll summarize it for folks that have never heard me talk about this, but you would have a standard, and this doesn't speak to like the movements themselves. This is just like a standard for those movements. But the standard would fluctuate based on pretty much the averages across whatever population you're looking at. So for example, if on test day I step up to the test as a 35-year-old male, and let's say I'm an infantryman, I could very quickly see what is the Army standard for me on this day, given all of how all of my peers are performing. And that would be a cool way of racking and stacking. And then what would be interesting is if you did it that way, then on aggregate, you could kind of see where the military or where certain demographics are trending over time. Are they getting fitter? Or are they getting less fit? And then you can address those issues. So I think frequent statistical changes to scores would be cool, but like changing the movements all the time just is a clusterfuck.
Fair. I do want to do a quick one. This is a public service announcement for folks. I think a lot of people wonder why there's a side shuffle in the middle of the sprint drag carry. I have heard people even claim that like some random general demanded there be a frontal plane lateral movement thing. As I understand it, and I do not have a documented resource to point to this, but I've heard it from sources with good placement and access. You'll note that the event is called the Sprint Drag Carry, not the Sprint Drag Shuffle Carry. And that's because, as I understand it, there was no lateral shuffle originally. Actually, originally, if you read the Bisper study, there was a sled drag, a sled push, and a shuttle run and a goblet squat, and they all got like Frankensteined together into one mega event. But the first iteration, once they were Frankenstein together, was a sprint, a drag, a sprint, a carry, and a sprint. No side shuffle. And the problem was, and you can go see this if you like, you take your guys out and try it.
Fall over.
People eat shit. They put face in the dirt, right? Like after the drag, you underestimate the fatigue on your legs. You try and sprint, you don't realize you have baby giraffe legs.
Mm-hmm.
Face in the dirt. So the lateral is there almost purely as an injury prevention mechanism / kind of embarrassment prevention mechanism so that people aren't constantly eating it when they try and do that sprint right after the drag.
It's almost like the QWERTY keyboard of
Yeah.
the testing event. For folks that don't know, the way that your keys are arranged on your computer is legitimately the most inefficient way
It's
for them to be arranged.
intentionally
Yep.
as inefficient as possible to avoid keys you would hit in sequence being close to each other, because that was a huge problem for typewriters jamming.
Right. They didn't want to jam typewriters. So here we are today, and this is a moral story about path dependency. Our solution was to create an inefficient test that kept people from falling over, basically. I'd rather get rid of the sprint drag carry. I know we already talked about this, and just throw in like a Secret Service snatch test. Just Google that for folks out there.
There's an article out there. Some captain or major wrote it a while back about kettlebell long cycle replacing the whole fitness test. I don't think you guys would argue for that if you had spent more times watching unsupervised Army physical training. I just wouldn't assign. And like maybe it's because we accept a low standard of athleticism, and if we just trained people on kettlebell snatch, kettlebell long cycle, they'd get more comfortable with it, and we'd develop the motor control and the coordination, and we'd all be awesome athletes. Maybe that's the case. I just don't feel comfortable knowing the people I know across the military saying like, hey, next week you're going to do as many reps as possible in either a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, of kettlebell snatch. You're going to end up with bruises on the back of the arm. You're going to end up with jacked around wrists. They're just not, I don't know. I don't think it would be good.
I think the real reason why we haven't gone to that is because kettlebells are Russian.
The military loves kettlebells. I can't think, there is no way there is any organization on the planet other than maybe the Russian military, but I doubt it, any other organization owns more kettlebells than the U.S. Army.
But I think in my experience across branches, it's less that the military at large loves kettlebells and more that like there's always the one, typically he's like a major. And like a couple years back, he went to a weekend kettlebell seminar. And
Listen
maybe
to some Pavel Tsatsouline.
Yeah, maybe he's met Pavel like once and he's got the handbook, like only the strongest will survive or whatever. And that dude is a freaking kettlebell disciple.
Mm-hmm.
Only does kettlebells. Having said that though, I think the Secret Service snatch test is of all the like tests I've come across, that one scares me the most. Or just long cycle kettlebells in general. That like swinging 24 kilo kettlebells for half an hour is insanity. But I digress.
I got a question for you. It's not on the notes sheet. So
Oh,
I hear stories mostly from organizations like Strong First and like Pavel Disciples of people only doing kettlebell training for months and months and months and then like PRing their deadlift or their squat or something. Have you ever seen that happen? Because I have trained kettlebells and had the opposite experience where if I like go full kettlebell, leave the barbell behind for a while, come back to it, I definitely have lost a step. Maybe I'm just not kettlebelling hard enough.
Yeah, you gotta bell out, dude. There are people listening to this right now who are gonna be super like, absolutely, that is what it happened to me. I think it could happen. Have I seen it happen? No, I haven't seen it happen myself, but I think it could happen if one of two things. If the break from traditional lifting is long enough to allow you to like low key recover without being short enough or sorry, I should say short enough to allow you to low key recover without being long enough that you lose whatever gains that you'd made in your like weightlifting trajectory. Because then what happens, and I have seen this happen a lot.
Now you're just describing a deload, not like
But
something special
exactly,
about kettlebells.
1000%. But what I'm getting at is I have seen folks deload without realizing they're deloading, come back to what they were doing and be stronger, and then attribute that increase in strength to whatever they were doing during the deload.
Yeah.
We saw this happen. I mentioned this before, but CrossFit actually had this happen early on, where a lot of these endurance type athletes switched to this high intensity stuff and then PR'd their endurance work. And truthfully, what it wasn't CrossFit. It was because they had taken a break from endurance work and then also added, some of the high intensity stuff that they hadn't done before, and it sort of rounded out their training.
Hmm.
But the other point I was going to make about the kettlebells is guys that truly, in my opinion, are getting after kettlebell training, they're using like really heavy kettlebells. They're doing a lot of work with them. They're building up a ton of volume. And then I think that kind of general like physical preparedness that they create can contribute to some increases in strength. But I've never seen a dude go from a 400-pound deadlift to a 500-pound deadlift just from doing some kettlebell swings for a few months.
That tracks. I like it.
So, anything else you want to hit on?
Just a brief version of a long rant, which is that I think we may have made an awful mistake by allowing the ACFT to get so political. I think like a couple senators weighed in and then changes were made. And that announces to people in the political space that in the culture war, military physical readiness standards are now a football we can kick around as part of this game. And I don't know if there's ever any going back from that unless somebody stands up and says, like, no, like this is how we're going to do it. We're going to stick to it. We're not going to play games for a while. We'll revisit this in a few years through a lens of like an actual assessment of what's working for the outcomes we care about, not is it fair or does it like fit the narrative we're looking for. I just worry we opened Pandora's box by allowing politicians to get so directly involved. And now we have like individual members of Congress giving speeches during committee meetings about the Army combat fitness test. It's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, I think the issue as I see it is that we don't know what we're trying to measure. And don't tell me
Yeah.
lethality is the answer because that's nothing. Like I think
Yeah.
that's the struggle, and I've said this before, like the struggle with like true tactical human performance is that we have never won or lost a battle because the bad guys deadlifted more than us. Like there's no one to one of,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you perform in the gym, ipso facto, you're more deadly. I think when people talk about lethality, what they're really trying to say is do X, Y, and Z, and you'll be better at killing bad guys. But I don't think there's a single X, Y, or Z you could do that will make you better at killing bad guys. I think it's so many intangibles, yada, yada, yada. So because that's the case, unless you have somebody who's willing to kind of confront that and then maybe put some parameters around, okay, if lethality is really just a made up thing, what are we testing for? Well, we're testing for fitness. Okay, well, what is fitness? It's this, it's this, it's this. Well, okay, you're either, in that case, you're either fit or you're not. So then we have to have, like we talked about earlier, the ability to eliminate people who aren't quote unquote fit. And I think if you do that, then you can get away from the politicization of the whole thing. But for lack of having those parameters and for lack of really truly being able to define these terms, you're leaving the door open for all kinds of conversations and committee meetings. And last point I'll make, I've said this before, you have as well. You shouldn't even be able to comment on it unless you can pass it.
Yeah, I
But
think
we
it
know that's
heavily
not going
comes
to
down
happen.
to people don't want to acknowledge this, but I think it comes down in a big way to how compelling an argument is being made and how respected and trusted the leaders making the argument are. I don't think it comes down to data as often as people want it to. I don't think it comes down to construct validity or face validity or whatever thing. I think it comes down to are the people championing the cause trusted and respected and making arguments that are compelling to the people.
Right. Which we're seeing unfold right now because I think the AFT and the justification behind it sort of bifurcating the force. You have some folks engaged in combat, some like you could convince me of that. But because the people doing that are doing it so poorly and trying to still wrap it up in the bullshit around data, it just doesn't work. So who knows? We'll see what happens.
All right. That's it for hot takes, I think, right?
I think that's everything. Team, we'll see you next week. Thanks for hanging out. Hey Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.